Today is Veterans Day, November 11th, 2022. Originally, Veterans Day marked the signing of the end of World War I and was called Armistice Day. It was signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918.
Today we celebrate and honor all veterans who have served or who are still serving during times of peace and as well as war. We thank you for your sacrifice in serving our country. Here are the veterans of Briarhill Middle School, student and staff.
Captain Jason Bates, U.S. Army. Elizabeth Bates' dad. Thank you, Dad.
Rick Cowan, British Marine, Zoe Cowan's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Michael Cable, U.S. Coast Guard, rescue swimmer, saved a family of 7 off the coast of New York. Cruz Cortez's stepdad. Thank you, Michael.
David Malloy, Army, Kinley Chapman's grandfather. Thank you, Poppy.
Joseph Accardi, Navy Construction Battalion, Wyatt Dureska's grandfather. Thank you, Pops.
Major Wilmer A. Duarte, Army, Natalia Duarte's stepdad. Thank you for all you've sacrificed.
A1C, JP Irwin, Air Force, stationed at Aviano Air Force Base, Italy. Chase Irwin's brother. Thank you, brother.
Mike Fulterman, Air Force, Ryan Fulterman's grandfather. Thank you, Poppy.
Captain Jesse Wahardo, Army National Guard. Come home safe, honey.
Master Sergeant Corey Messingham, Army, Mia Martin's uncle. Thank you, Uncle Corey.
Sergeant Daniel Minter, Marines. Staff Sergeant V.A. Sockwell, Army. Kayla Grextus, dad and great-grandfather. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, great-grandpa.
Daniel Kettlehood, Navy, Mia Kettlehood's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Tristan Williamson, Army, Jackson John Wells' uncle. Thank you, Tristan.
Chief Master Sergeant Dale G. Atkinson, Air Force, Hannah Johnson's grandpa. Thank you, Hannah's grandpa.
Roger A. Patrick, Army, Bryson Patrick's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Philip Copa, Marines.
Tanya Copa, Navy.
Tori and Nico Copa's parents. Thank you, Mom and Dad.
Mark Moda, U.S. Army, Corps of Engineers, Giovanni Moda's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Commander David Howells, Navy, Lawson Porter's great-grandfather. Thank you.
Clay Rennick, Navy, Charles Rennick, Navy, Jack Robbins, Army, Jackson Rennick's grandfather and great-grandfathers. Thank you, Papa Clay.
Herbert Huseman, Army, Steve Huseman, Air Force, Justin Huseman, Navy, Jack Skelton's great-grandfather, great-uncle, and uncle. Thank you, Uncle Justin and family.
Clint Hammer, U.S. Army, Caleb Hammer and Micah Hammer's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Barrett Waldridge, Army Reserve, Tata Waldridge's brother. Thank you, brother.
Jack Strother, Army, Hunter Strother's dad. Thank you, Dad. Jeff Slater, Army, Shaylin Slater's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Hugh Jones Sr. and Eli Douglas, Army. Mia Alfaro's great-grandfathers. Thank you, Papa and Granddad.
Dean Nelson, Army, Caleb Tomlin's papa and Mrs. Tomlin's dad. Thank you, Papa.
Gunnery Sergeant Joey Cedillo, Marines, Andres Cedillo and Jesse Secondino's dad.
Thank you, Dad.
Thank you, Dad.
Jalen Bonka,
Aurelie Bonka O'Brien's uncle. Thank you, Uncle.
Thank you, Uncle.
Master Sergeant Edward J. McDonald, Army.
Molly Mackenzie McDonald's great-grandfather.
Thank you. Jim Mitchell, Air Force.
Seth Joplin and Annabelle Mitchell's grandfather. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Pat.
Chief Master Sergeant Thomas H. Taylor, Ralph Taylor, James Taylor, Charlie Anderson, and Paul Schwab all served in the Air Force, and Adam Barnes served in the Army. Wow. These are all Preston Taylor's grandfathers, uncles, great-uncle, and cousin. Thank you so much for your service.
Sergeant Red Graves, Marines, Nicholas Graves' dad. Thank you, Dad.
Rick Deering, Army, Liam Molden's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Stephanie Regis, Navy, Nora Regis's mom. Thank you.
James Humes, Navy. Michael Humes, Dad. Thank you, Dad.
Robert Koba, Navy. Harold Bossy, Army. Kevin Rudolphs, great-grandpa and grandpa. Thanks, Grandpa and great-grandpa.
Michael Eves, Navy. Joshua Goins, Air Force. Jim Eves, Army. Joseph Kellum, Army Air Corps. Ron Grantham, Royal British Army. Dugan Goins, Army. Josie Grantham's uncles, grandfather, and great-grandfathers. Thank you for serving our country.
Ricardo Kowalczyk, Army. Hannah Kowalczyk Blanco's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Brian Boykin, Marines. Herman Bubba Boykin, Army. Gabe Bartos's uncle and great-grandfather. Thank you, Uncle Brian and great-grandfather.
Joseph Matthews, Army. Everett Winter's grandpa. Thank you, Grandpa.
Jerry Pomacall, Army. Willie Dean Hall LaRoche, U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps. Dr. Harold G. Nelson, Navy. Dylan LaRoche's great-grandfathers and great-grandmother. Thank you, Big Grandpa, Grandma Ski, and Grandpa Doc.
Ernie Goff, Army. Ainsley and Annabelle Goff's granddaddy. Thank you, Granddad.
Derek LeBlanc, Deep Sea Diver, Navy. Jackson Bialik's stepdad. Thank you, Derek.
Major David Jackson, Army. Served 2 tours in Vietnam. Christian Kumar's grandfather. Thank you, Grandpa.
George Birmingham, Air Force.
Cardin and Park Dobbs' Papa. Thank you, Papa.
Thank you, Papa.
Stan Luce, Air Force. Kason Kramer and Noah Luce's grandfather. Thank you, Bob.
H.E. Buck Buchanan, Army.
Hannah and Haley Leslie's great-grandfather. Thank you, Daddy Buck.
Will Spegg, Army. Madden and Cooper Kins's grandfather. Thank you, Grandpa.
Luis Enriquez, Navy. Maya Enriquez's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Richard J. Foy, Army. Jesse Foy's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Major Nanette Trevino and Master Sergeant Donald S. Trevino, Air Force, plus with a side Airman First Class Milton J. Hubbard, Air Force. Gage Lee's grandparents and great-grandfather. Thank you, family.
Paul Codd, U.S. Coast Guard. Holly Codd's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Lieutenant Commander Jack Strickland, Navy, F-14 pilot. Tyler and Becca DeMassey's great-uncle. Thank you, Uncle Jack.
Scott Chance, Army.
Logan and Haley Chance's dad. Thank
you,
you, Dad.
Davis Watkins Jr., Air Force, and Davis Watkins Sr., Army. Madeline Missouri's uncle and grandpa. Thank you, Uncle Davis and Grandpa.
Robert Cruz, Air Force. Michael Cruz and Christopher Cruz, Army. Mrs. Hudson's grandfather and uncles. Thank you, Poppy, Uncle Mike, and Uncle Chris.
Steve Stroop, also known as Mr. Steve, bus driver for bus 357, Navy and Marines Reserve. LISD bus driver. Thank you, Mr. Steve. Charles Parson, Army Air Corps, K-9 Division. Sybil and Dr. C.F. Hamilton, Army World War II medics. Dr. Sam Miranda, Army World War II. Dr. Jack Grants, Army. Cole Nelson's great-grandparents. Thank you, family.
Chris Horton, U.S. Navy, Mrs. Horton's husband. Thank you, babe.
Captain Connor Saul, Army. Blake Walters' cousin. Thank you for serving your country.
Donald Zelk, Army, Korean War. Zuri Zelk's grandfather. Thank you, Grandpa.
Captain Larry E. Coons, U.S. Air Force. Ms. Beard's boyfriend. Thank you, Larry.
William Chapman, U.S. Army. Malia Chapman's dad. Thank you, Dad.
Wallace Sanders, U.S. Navy. Ben Sanders, Grandpa. Thank you, Grandpa.
Tino Rosas, Army. Jake Davis's grandfather. Thank you, Granddad.
Joe Gray, E-5 Sergeant, U.S. Army. Jonathan Grade's dad. Thank you.